Hey guys, and welcome to week 8 of International Business. This week we are looking at global and regional economic integration as our broad topic here. And this is effectively referring to the way in which countries and regions around the world are coming closer together to make it easier to do business both within and across those regions. And as much as anything else, it presents a magnificent opportunity for some gloriously awkward photos, and we've got a number of them here. On the left here you've got a photo of what has got to be one of the most awkward looking handshake attempts by a group known as the Three Amigos. I think they coined that themselves and referred to themselves as the Three Amigos. Former President Barack Obama, the current Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, and the current President of Mexico, Enrique Peña Nieto, all just looking real awkward there. And then on the right, we have a photo from the Vietnamese G20 summit a few years ago. As you can see, some of the biggest and most powerful people, global leaders, all dressed up in traditional Vietnamese outfits, looking real uncomfortable. And yet, despite the awkward photos, there are a number of positives to be associated with global and regional economic integration. We're going to have a look at those today, as well as some of the potential negatives and the different levels that it may occur at, and before finally looking at some of the actual examples which you may well have heard of already to this point. So our objectives for this week, firstly to obviously understand what we're talking about here, defining, conceptualizing and understanding regional economic integration, as well as those levels I talked about, exploring the economic and political arguments for and against this level of the levels of integration, examining the history, current scope and potential future implications for these key regional trading blocks and agreements that we see around the world today, and also understanding what this all means for you guys as international business managers of the future. Alright, so when we do talk about regional economic integration, we're broadly referring to agreements between countries in a geographic region, obviously, to reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers to the free flow of goods, services and other factors of production between each other. So effectively looking to remove or at least reduce those key barriers to trade that we spoke about a few weeks ago, just to make it easier to do business for firms across national borders. Does beg the question, do they actually promote free trade then? Certainly in theory, absolutely that is the case. But what some researchers actually indicate is we may in fact be moving towards a situation at the moment where we have a number of different regional trade blocs who actually end up competing with one and against one another rather than actually promoting free trade on a global scale. Now when we talk about regional trade blocks, we're not talking about these type of blocks, not the band, we're talking about groups of countries, typically in a region, hence the name, who come together and make it easier to do business within that group or that region, but end up in a situation, as we talk about here, where it's fine to do business within, but not potentially so easy to do business across these different regional trading blocks or trading groups. So yes, on a small scale, absolutely it's promoting free trade, but on a global scale there are questions as to whether it's actually being effective in that sense. It's also important to understand that there are various types and levels of regional economic integration here. So there may be bilateral agreements which are between two countries. There may be multilateral agreements which are between multiple countries, i.e. effectively more than two. There might be regional agreements which, not surprisingly, centre around a particular region, multi-regional which integrate a number of different regions around the world, or at the highest level an international economic integration, which is something, and we'll give you a few examples of each of these over the coming slides, but here we're looking at something which covers most of the globe. It can also be broken down into low-level versus high-level integration. Now, low-level is where you focus on only a particular part or a segment or an industry within the economy, whereas a high-level tends to integrate and incorporate a greater number of these different parts and industries within the economies of those participating nations. All right. Let's look at a couple of reasons both for and against here economic integration, both on a regional and a global scale. And there are a number of positives here. Look, Chuck Norris, he's all about it. The first one that we're going to look at here are the economic implications. And in a very simple sense, this means that when you create these free trade agreements and these trading blocks, it means easier access to larger markets, more economic clout, and basically more potential consumers and customers and buyers of the products that you're looking to sell internationally. You know, it just makes it easy in a very simple sense to do business across these national borders. There are also positive political implications, so it can actually improve international relations across different countries. It can help establish strategic alliances where different countries would like to position themselves closer together and work together, and certainly establishing free trade agreements and so on is a good way to help facilitate that process. Also facilitating social and cultural integration might be a priority for certain countries. They might be looking to respond to globalization, to increase their international voice or power. That's a key one, that a lot of the time when we see the establishment of these trading blocks or these groups or these agreements, it's so that especially smaller countries and nations can enhance their ability to be heard, so that they actually have a representative or a voice in discussions with a lot of these larger trading partners. It, of course, at least in theory, should aid the achievement of peace and cohesion on a global scale. The more we try and bring countries together, the better that relationship should be there in general. And also, overall, they're useful in terms of avoiding either current or potentially future-oriented attempts at protectionism. We've spoken previously about how there's a lot of concern about countries imposing some of these key trade impediments like tariffs, like import quotas and so on. And these are a good response to help move against that and actually promote and liberalise global trade. Unfortunately, as always, there are haters that are going to hate. I apologise for using the same gag in a few videos now. But there are also some key arguments to be aware of actually against regional or global economic integration. The first is the concern relating to the marginalisation of selected groups. So some people and organisations and potentially even countries have expressed concerns that while sure, a lot of these smaller nations may get a say and a voice to a certain extent when they become part of these particular trading agreements and trading blocks, but typically we usually see these key major dominant nations who end up controlling those particular situations, and if anything, long term they usually end up being the winners, so to speak, in those trading blocks and agreements. And there is concern whether the smaller minority type countries and nations end up being taken advantage of. And as we've also spoken about earlier this semester, there are concerns over national sovereignty here, which, as we talked about previously, relates to this sense that the different countries and cultures are unique and special and different from one another, and that we might be losing some of that as we move more and more towards an integrated global economy. When we have these regional trading blocks, are we creating a regional culture and losing key elements of what makes each country unique and different? Perhaps the biggest argument, certainly from an international business perspective, is this centres around the debate over trade creation versus trade diversion. Now, trade creation is a key term that refers to a situation where low-cost producers within a free trade area are replacing high-cost domestic producers. So, for example, imagine a situation where a US firm may be able to take advantage through a free trade agreement with a Mexican supplier, so that it is able to now source cheaper suppliers from the Mexican firm than it was able to do with its local US suppliers. That is creating trade within that free trade area and is known as trade creation. The opposite of this, well, not the opposite, but the negative side here, is known as trade diversion, and this occurs when higher cost suppliers within that free trade area replace lower cost external suppliers. So imagine that same situation where the US firm originally had, for example, a cheap supplier from Bangladesh for whatever particular products it produced, And then imagine that the free trade agreement is established and it encourages that US firm to now deal with a Mexican supplier who, sure, they might be cheaper than a US supplier, but they might actually be more expensive than that external Bangladeshi supply firm. In that case, we are actually creating or seeing trade diversion where it's not actually the cheapest way of doing business on an international level. And so some of the criticism or the argument against regional economic integration is based around the idea that it's only beneficial if the amount of trade it creates exceeds the amount it diverts. And research indicates that that's not always the case, that sometimes we see greater levels of trade diversion occurring as a result of the establishment of these free trade areas. So we're actually not making it cheaper to do international trade. In the next video, we're going to have a look at those different levels of economic integration that we see around the world.